Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Robinson Run. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. This is the third part of our study of the Robinson Run community here in the Whiskey Rebellion. Of course, the rebellion that occurs from 1791 to 1794. Behind me is one of the oldest cabins here in Allegheny County. This is known as the Ewing Walker Glass House. Of course, that's what we call it today. In the 18th century, this will be the second home of one Gabriel Walker. Now, you'll recall Gabriel Walker originally had his homestead right near Robinson Run until September of 1782. In 1782, British Allied native warriors, detached from Captain Andrew Brandt's group, which attacked Fort Henry and Wheeling, rampaged through Robinson Run, burning the cabins and settlements, taking captives, or killing 5 of Gabriel Walker's children. 2, of course, were murdered, and we found their graves in previous episodes of Robinson Run, and 3 were taken to Fort Detroit, paroled by British Allied native warriors. This cabin, which sits on the grounds of what is today the Pittsburgh Botanic Gardens, a place I know very well, I volunteer my time a lot here, was the second home of Gabriel Walker. This one on high ground, on a hill overlooking Robinson Run, and the place where he'll spend the rest of his life. This was preserved for many years by Allegheny County Parks as the Settler's Cabin. So Settler's Cabin County Park was named after this building. But today, this sits on the grounds of Pittsburgh Botanic Garden. They regularly offer tours of it as part of their Pioneer Frontier Homestead. I do a lot of work here personally myself. But it's a wonderful cabin, and it's the sort of second chance for Gabriel Walker and his family. This piece of ground is one of the oldest pieces of ground delineated here in Allegheny County, and it was originally owned by Gabriel Walker and his brother Isaac Walker. They called it Partnership, and that was a good name. I'll put the image and land map of Partnership on the screen now. You can see some of the borders and boundaries of it. But I think it really shows the resilience of Gabriel Walker, his ability to not give in to sorrow and not crumble in the face of adversity, his chance to start over again in the wake of the terrible calamities of the American Revolution. But this cabin's unique because it's also where Gabriel Walker will live during the Whiskey Rebellion. And as we'll see here in this episode, episode 3 of our Whiskey Rebellion section, episode 19, if you can believe it, of Robinson Run, this is going to be the spot where Gabriel Walker will be sleeping when the retribution, when the revenge, when the consequences of his role in the Whiskey Rebellion finally befalls him. In November of 1794, government forces led by, you guessed it, none other than Alexander Hamilton, will come to this cabin. Soldiers will knock on Gabriel Walker's door and drag him from his home. They'll take him to Pittsburgh in a prison camp, and there he'll pay the price for what was at the time considered to be sedition, and ultimately tried as treason for his role in the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, this is the original structure. It has been lovingly maintained and updated over the years. Believe it or not, descendants of the Walkers lived in this cabin well into the 20th century. So if you're ever near the Pittsburgh Botanic Garden outside of Oakdale, you're just above Robinson Run itself. Pop in and say hello, and you're looking at the place where Gabriel Walker spent his final days. And it's going to be a wonderful intro for us to talk about the events of 1794, when government forces numbering 13,000 men stormed into Pittsburgh and unleashed a wave of arrests and incarceration for the 4-year Whiskey Rebellion. Let's head back into the office and talk about how that all came about. All right, everybody, welcome back to the office. Now that we've seen where Gabriel Walker moved to and how he tried to reestablish himself, of course, after his home was burned by British Allied native warriors in the 1780s, we can catch back up on his role in the Whiskey Rebellion. You recall that last time we were together, we saw violence spin out of control here in the West. in response to President George Washington, and maybe equally so, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton's new Whiskey Act. We saw acts of violence occur in places like Pigeon Creek in today Washington County, Pennsylvania. We saw the burning of the home of Inspector of Revenue and Revolutionary War hero General John Neville in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. And we've seen our Robinson Run community members poking their heads in every once in a while. When the episode ended, episode 18, we finally see this huge meeting at Braddock's Field, August of 1794, and the march against the city of Pittsburgh. And we see for certain that some of our Robinson Run community members were participants, particularly the Walker brothers, Isaac and Gabriel, as well as Joseph Scott. How do I know that? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're also going to see the conclusion of the Whiskey Rebellion, as well as the enormous role that the Robinson Run community plays in it. I know to this point we've just been maybe tracking them back and forth. Today we will see them the whole time. So we have to do a little catching up before we get there. With the March on Pittsburgh foiled, President George Washington in the nation's capital, not Washington, D.C. yet, but Philadelphia, decides the time to act is now. And in reading the Constitution, it says he is commander-in-chief. He is responsible for what the Constitution describes as domestic tranquility, that is to say, peace. And he takes it upon himself to mean, or at least interpret that as meaning, that if there is a rebellion in American territory, even by its own citizens, he has to suppress it. He meets with his cabinet members. They agree the time to act is now. And he turns to a law called the Militia Act of 1792, which says that the president is allowed to suppress domestic rebellion as long as a Supreme Court justice agrees. So, of course, that's going to be his next step. President Washington doesn't wait long to seek out the approval of Supreme Court Justice James Wilson. And he's very conflicted by this decision. He knows he's the nation's first president. He doesn't want to be the one that has to suppress the potential for rebellion and civil war using military force. But he also knows that being commander-in-chief means you have to make difficult decisions. So on August 4th, 1794, really just a few days after the March on Pittsburgh here in the West, by rebel leaders like David Bradford, and of course, at least 3 of our 4 Robinson Run community members that we've been studying, he receives the Supreme Court's approval to do that. Western Pennsylvania is declared to be in a state of rebellion, and Washington is compelled to act. Now, August 7th, just about a week after the March on Pittsburgh begins, President Washington will make one of the most important presidential proclamations of his 8 years in office. And it's a very long, sweeping proclamation that clearly defines what brought him to the point of using military intervention against his own people. But he begins it with 3 words that I think ring true throughout all of American history. And that is, he says, with, quote, the deepest regret, this action has to occur. He commands all of the rebels or insurgents, however you want to view them, to disperse by September 1st. And he proceeds to call upon any form of army that he can muster together to march from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and suppress this rebellion. So here's what's really important for us. We don't really have a U.S. Army at this time. We have something of an army. It's called the Legion of the United States. At this time, they are marching concurrently in what is today the state of Ohio to fight the Western Confederacy of Indian Nations. That's a story happening and affecting the West at the same time as the Whiskey Rebellion. So he has to call upon state governments to provide militias to march here to Pittsburgh, and he wants 15,000 men. Alexander Hamilton begins a staunch and aggressive letter-writing campaign to the governors of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia to muster troops. And when it's all said and done, Washington will accrue an army of about 13,000 men. He wanted 15,000, but that number included members and citizens of Western Pennsylvania. And obviously, they're on the other side here. But he will get 13,000 men from 4 different states. And each of these state militias will be led by their own governors. Now, what's really important in this deal is that Washington, of course, gets his home state of Virginia to provide men. And there's an added bonus with that. And the added bonus is that you get the governor of Virginia marching in the field. Who is the governor of Virginia? Well, it's none other than the famed Revolutionary War general, and honestly, probably in terms of strategy and tactics, a better battlefield commander than Washington, Henry Lee, also called Light Horse Harry Lee. You'll know him as the direct ancestor of Robert E. Lee from the American Civil War, and again, one of the greatest generals in all of Washington's Patriot Army 10 years earlier in the American Revolution. You also get Light Horse Harry Lee's second in command, Revolutionary War Titan, hero, giant named Daniel Morgan. So these are men with enormous, important careers in the American Revolution. And amazingly, they get called back into service 10 years later to descend upon whiskey country, Western Pennsylvania. And yes, that includes the people of Robinson Run who are participating in the rebellion. Now, what I think is really unique is that Washington has never seen another president before. There's never been one, right? And the Constitution says he is commander-in-chief of the army. So the way Washington interprets that is that he must lead these men himself. And he puts himself in a carriage and he leads this army into Pittsburgh personally. And incredibly, this is the first and only time in American history that a sitting president, while in office, ever leads an army into the battlefield as commander-in-chief. George Washington doesn't have the memo that he doesn't actually have to do that. And I really don't think we're going to see any president of the modern era, whoever it may be when you're watching this, in an F-16 fighter jet anytime soon. So we're going to say that this will be the only time that a U.S. president ever leads troops into the field of battle. President Washington will lead the army as far as Bedford, Pennsylvania. I'd love to tell you that he rode a white horse, as you see here, into Pittsburgh for this, enormous legendary battle. It doesn't happen because Washington believed that the Whiskey Rebellion was really hemmed into the distant west across the Appalachian Mountains, really just around Pittsburgh, southwestern PA. And he had a little test for that. And the test was the city of Bedford, Pennsylvania. Because Bedford is kind of a federal city in the 1790s. It's got a federal fort. It's got federal offices. Washington believed that if you got to Bedford, which is really, if you can visualize Pennsylvania today, the very first city, west of the Appalachian Mountains. Like when you first enter the west, Bedford's kind of your landing spot. He believed if Bedford was not rebelling, if Bedford was not seditious, that the rebellion was probably hemmed in to the distant west. And he didn't really need to go all the way. He was president. He had other things to do. And when he arrived in Bedford, the scene you see here, he's met with parades and celebrations and dinners. It's a real festival atmosphere. The residents of Bedford are excited to see order restored. They have a big sign made that says, "Woe to anarchy." Anarchy being the Whiskey Rebellion. And Washington feels very satisfied that his presence really isn't needed here. And he'll turn around and go back to Philadelphia. Now, what's really important for us is that the army will continue into Whiskey Country. 13,000 men. This army gets sort of cast aside in history a lot, but remember, this is one of the biggest armies Washington's ever commanded in his entire life. So this is no small measure. And Washington instructs 3 men to lead the army the rest of the way. One will be the head of Virginia troops, who we mentioned, Light Horse Harry Lee. Two will be the leader of the Pennsylvania troops, a general named William Irvine, former commandant of the Western Department of the Continental Army. And a third will be Daniel Morgan. Now, interesting here, as Washington's about to turn around and go home, a voice perks up. And that voice is none other than Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, the man who's really been engineering this law, and maybe, if you view it that way, engineering this crisis from the beginning. That's what Westerners would say. Again, you know me, I'm somewhere in the middle. Hamilton says, can I go with the army? Can I see this suppression of these Western people in rebellion through? And President Washington will allow that. So Morgan and Light Horse Harry Lee, the Virginians, Irvine, the Pennsylvanian, and Alexander Hamilton of New York via the Caribbean will lead this 13,000-man militia into whiskey country. I think it's really important to note here who's in these armies. Most of the men in this army that Washington has led west are young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, new recruits. Most of them way too young to have ever fought in the American Revolution 10 years earlier. They're kind of the next generation. Pretty green. It should be noted that most of the rebels in western Pennsylvania, including those at Robinson Run, are battle-hardened Revolutionary War veterans. And it's what makes this story so complicated. You know, we celebrate their Revolutionary service, forming, creating our country, and then 10 years later, they're trying to secede from it and effectively destroy it. So history's not black and white. It never is. We like it that way, but it never is. History's really gray and mucky and murky, and that makes it complicated. People don't like it. That's reality. And folks like you and I, history people, right? We're the ones that have to dive into that murky gray area because that's where the real work is. As the federal troops, and they're really state militia units, are marching into Pittsburgh. It's now October of 1794. One of the things we see, and I say this thankfully, is that the rebellion loses its nerve. The people of Pittsburgh and western Pennsylvania and western Virginia, they didn't stiffen up and prepare for a fight. They were worried because they really didn't want to fight their own people. They were unhappy, but they didn't want a military showdown. And the rebellion sort of collapses as the army approaches. The leadership of the rebellion flees. Remember David Bradford, the man who took over leadership of the Whiskey Rebellion, the Robespierre of the West, he called himself, right? He made the rebellion change from a protest to a secession movement. He bails completely. He abandons his family in Washington, PA, and he sneaks down the Ohio River in Mississippi, down to the area around New Orleans. And that's not American territory at this time. That's Spanish territory. It's disputable, back and forth kind of land. But he'll spend the rest of his days down there. He'll leave his family and flee for the West because he knows he's led a pretty terrible crime against his country. And he knows that he'll certainly be judged for it. So he gets the heck out of town. And a lot of the Whiskey Rebellion leaders do too. So what's going to happen to all these residents of western Pennsylvania who have been rebelling against their own country for now almost 4 years? Well, that's where diplomacy comes in. Because a group of people, we'll call them moderates, the voices of reason, will say to their neighbors, listen, if we keep the fight up, we're going to be arrested. We could be tried and hanged. We need to broker a peace. This army is on its way, and they're coming for us. So at a place called Parkinson's Ferry, which is today Monongahela, Pennsylvania. Of course, I'll take you there in a second. I'll show you what's what and where's where. Moderate voices meet along the Monongahela River, and they will begin negotiating with the army as it's approaching Pittsburgh. We're going to know a lot of the people who are there. Albert Gallatin will be there. Albert Gallatin is a U.S. Senator, but he's from the West via Switzerland, but he makes his life here, and he'll speak for these people. This is the place, Parkinson's Ferry, where the cool, calm, and collected voices that have really kind of been quiet for the last 3 years retake control of this whole event. The extremists had control of it for a while. They were burning down tax collectors' homes, attacking the home of General John Neville, engaging in firefights with federal troops. That's what happened when the extremists took over. This is what's going to happen when moderate, reasonable voices take over. And when you look at who's at Parkinson's Ferry along the Monongahela River in 1794 in the fall, anyone who's had any inclination toward the federal government will be there because they believe they can be a solution. So no surprise to us, guess who shows up? None other than our own Robinson Run leader, the wealthiest man in the community, the great land baron, Squire James Ewing. Remember, from the beginning of the rebellion, James Ewing has never sided with these extremists. He wasn't happy about the law, but he wasn't going to attack agents of his own government. He wasn't going to burn and attack tax collectors' homes and pour tar on these poor people, his own neighbors who happened to work for the government. He was wealthy. He was more dignified. He had a lot of land at stake and a lot of money at stake. He's always been the steady rock of Robinson Run. But his politics are different than his neighbors. He's more pro-government. The Walkers, the Scotts, they're very much on the other side. So here we see James Ewing, an aged man. He's a man now in his 60s, stepping up and doing what he can to save his community. It's a remarkable change. I want you guys to remember, when I began this series, I picked these people and these names at random. Robinson Run was a random choice, a single Western Pennsylvania community that I hoped, if we studied it, would tell us a little more about the frontier. I picked the Scotts and the Walkers and the Ewings at random. And look at what they've turned into. You guys have been watching this for a year. It's been a year of my life. I can't believe where the research has led. And folks, you haven't seen anything yet. In this episode alone, you're going to see things that'll blow your mind. So James Ewing's going to be at Parkinson's Ferry, the voice of reason, one of many, trying to save his neighbors with the looming threat of a federal army, really state militias, bearing down on them. So hang tight for 1 second. We're going to head down to Parkinson's Ferry, today Monongahela, Pennsylvania, and take a look around. We are here in rainy and cold and summer, I guess you call this, Monongahela, Pennsylvania. Very important place here in our Whiskey Rebellion story, because this is the site where the moderate elements of the Whiskey Rebellion reclaim their rightful place in the movement. If you will recall, there were very moderate people in the Whiskey Rebellion at the beginning. Men who did not like the Whiskey Act, but certainly men who were not violent and destructive. And there were radical elements too, but by the time we get to 1794, those radical elements really took over the movement. And the moderate men were either silenced through violent means, their homes and farms and whiskey stills were attacked, or they were simply forced out of the region out of fear. Well, as we talked about earlier here in the office, George Washington will be leading an army now of retaliation of 13,000 men from Philadelphia, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia here to the west. And the leadership of the Whiskey Rebellion really loses its nerve. That's what brings us here to Monongahela, Pennsylvania today in the Mon Valley. The Monongahela River sits right here to my left. This was an important place in the Mon Valley. It was kind of in the middle of everything. In the 18th century, Monongahela, Pennsylvania was called Parkinson's Ferry because a man named Benjamin Parkinson, big, strong man, big red beard, very famous for that, operated a ferry across the Monongahela River. So it was a well-known area, well-known in the area, central meeting place. It was at this spot, often called Whiskey Point, that the moderates, as this army was bearing down here into the west, and people really began to be afraid of being arrested and prosecuted, that the moderates reclaimed control of the narrative. Men, of course, like Albert Gallatin, U.S. Senator, future Treasury Secretary, and for our purposes here on Robinson Run, James Ewing, are going to come to this spot, what they start to call Whiskey Point, to negotiate through intermediaries and diplomats with the oncoming federal army. Now, behind me is a high bluff, and this was going to be the spot where the whiskey negotiators met. Again, James Ewing, for our purposes on Robinson Run, being one of the most important. But if you look over my right shoulder here, you're going to see a gray building. This building is Krall's Flower Shop, Krall's Monongahela Flower Shop, and it's a fairly new building. This is going to be a really important landmark for us because this will be the original site of the log cabin where these whiskey negotiators met and debated and worked out terms with the oncoming national army, really a militia army. When they negotiated on this spot, and believe it or not, I'll have a picture here, that log cabin existed until 1913, I think, sometime in the early 20th century. That was eventually taken down. But what they negotiated on this spot, again, James Ewing, a voice of reason amongst them, I have to keep belaboring that point because it's why we're here, was that the men who participated in the Whiskey Rebellion would have an opportunity to pursue an amnesty and take what they called an oath of allegiance. Where and when these oaths of allegiances were going to be different, we'll talk about that a little more in the office. But they would have to be done in front of a witness. They would have to be done, if possible, in front of a justice of the peace. But what it avoided, even though it wasn't probably an easy pill to swallow for a lot of the rebels, was them hanging by the neck as traitors, guilty of sedition and treason, which, as we can already have talked about, something that Alexander Hamilton was probably very interested in. So here we are, Whiskey Point, Parkinson's Ferry, today, Monongahela, Pennsylvania. This was a critical place here in the Whiskey Rebellion, and the little flower shop behind me is going to be a really, really great place to see that. All right, let's head back into the office and continue this story. Now that we're back in the office and we saw what Parkinson's Ferry looked like, you see kind of how important it is. And you also see how complicated, many-sided the Whiskey Rebellion really was. And I would argue you really can't understand it until you understand the 40 years leading up to it. Incidentally, if you want to understand that, go back and watch every other episode of Robinson Run. That's the whole point. But we do see the efforts of the diplomats at Parkinson's Ferry result in a way out for their neighbors. And the way out it results in is the creation and the signing of an amnesty and an oath of allegiance for anyone who participated in any rebellious activities of any sort. Now, there's always been a lot of mystery around this because we have sources that tell us what the amnesty looks like, what the oath of allegiance looks like. We're not going to see it here in this episode. It's basically a pledge of allegiance. But we didn't have a lot of the fine details. And this is what's amazing about this time period. Remember a few episodes ago, episode 16, I met with a man I consider a good friend of mine now, named John Scott. And John showed us his whole family history. He was a descendant, of course, of Joseph Scott, who we've been studying. And in one of these Tupperware bins that John had, amazingly in his attic, he produced this document here, made on a typewriter, people, a typewriter. It's not digital. It's not available anywhere. I guess it is now. And it's called Men of the Whiskey Rebellion in Southwestern Pennsylvania, edited by Elizabeth J. Wall. And when I saw this typed up manuscript, and there's sources listed in the back, it's legitimate, I was floored. Because it has all the information that none of us have ever had when studying this event. I mean, this is the Rosetta Stone of the Whiskey Rebellion. That is to say, it fills in all the gaps we never had. And it wasn't in a library. And it wasn't in the digital archive. It was in John Scott's private collection, just because his family had lived on the same farm for give or take 250 years. I'm going to take you through it now. I'm so excited for this. Hang tight. The first thing we're going to see is that when these local farmers turned rebels want to get out of their seditious rebel activity from the Whiskey Rebellion, they have to go to a certain place at a certain time and take an oath of allegiance. And they have to do it in front of a witness. Now, the place where they go is going to be the place where they normally go to vote. That made sense. The infrastructure, the communicable sort of information, where to be and when, everybody knew that. But what stands out to me is when it happens and who's there. Because here we see the date, September 11th, 1794. We're going to see the community members of Robinson Run show up to take an oath of allegiance and swear an amnesty. And look who is the one witnessing the swearing in and the oath. Look who it is. It's not going to surprise you. It's outlined there in red. James Ewing himself, Squire James Ewing, this powerful, prominent landowner, the man who never turned rebel, the man who never turned seditious when the Whiskey Rebellion began, the man who shared the same history as all of his neighbors, early settler, Revolutionary War veteran, but he never joined. And remember, there's reasons for that. Ewing came from Maryland, wealthy. The rest of the Robinson Run community came from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, maybe a little more inclined toward distrusting outsiders and distrusting an outside government. But Ewing's going to be the one that they come before and lay their hand on the Bible, so to speak, and take the oath of allegiance. Incredible. And again, we wouldn't have this information if not for the book that I just showed you. Let's keep looking. When you examine who took the oath of allegiance from the Whiskey Rebellion on September 11th, 1794, here around Robinson Run, you're going to see a lot of names. Now, this book's pretty marked up. It's been in John's family for decades, literally. But three names stand out to me right away. You can see the first two in the top image here. On September 11th, 1794, Isaac Walker and Gabriel Walker both will take the oath of allegiance. Between them, you have John and James. These are children, extended family members of the Walkers. They all swear the oath. They swear it to their neighbor, James Ewing, a man who they probably politically disliked for most of the last 4 years, because he's been on the opposite side. But this is an episode about reconciliation, at least everybody thinks. We'll continue down the list a bit, and you can see there, Joseph Scott, Esquire. Remember, he was not only an attorney, but a justice of the peace. We'll say justice of the peace. More than attorney, justice of the peace. He will sign that document, and he'll take the oath of allegiance as the state armies are bearing down on Pittsburgh. These men are trying to avoid being arrested and prosecuted. But we still haven't seen what they've done yet. And that information we never had. Don't worry, I found it. That's why I made this episode. But that's still a mystery for us. But we know that they did something bad enough that they felt like they had to take the oath of allegiance to spare themselves of the shame that comes with it. By the time the armies of militias of Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey get to Pittsburgh, that agreement for amnesty, that enticement of some sort of mercy, kind of melts away. What essentially happens is, under the command of Alexander Hamilton, under his orders, a lot of cases they'll use those amnesties to arrest men who participated in the rebellion. I'm not going to say it was a full about face. That is to say, I'm not going to say it was like a trick, a dirty tactic. But the amnesty seems to melt away in terms of importance by November of 1794. Because under Alexander Hamilton and Light Horse Harry Lee's orders, that 13,000-man army, and I say this in my book, The Whiskey Rebellion, A Distilled History of an American Crisis, becomes the largest police action in American history. There's no big battle in Pittsburgh, but what that 13,000 man army does is becomes law enforcement. In the West, this event will be known as the Dreadful Night. And what it essentially looks like is using Pittsburgh as a base of operations. The state militias under Hamilton and Lee's control will branch out into western Pennsylvania. Washington County and Allegheny County first, Westmoreland County and Bedford later. And they'll begin arresting people. And they're not very discriminatory. Pretty much anyone who had anything to do with any sort of rebellious activities, even just attending a rally, is arrested. And again, Westerners will call these arrests the Dreadful Night. The Federals would say they're just restoring order and justice. Westerners call it the Dreadful Night. And this is a really brutal time. They wait till nightfall, and I think that's intentional. And they kick in people's doors. Frontier cabins like we already saw at the beginning of our episode with the home of Gabriel Walker. They reach into these homes, they drag these guys out of their beds, usually in their PJs, and they march them to a holding facility. They'll put these men in basements for 3 and 4 days at a time without food and water. Women and children are screaming as their fathers are dragged from their homes. In a lot of cases, they'll arrest them without warrants or without cause. In one instance, they had to march a group of these rebels who were arrested in Washington, PA, to Pittsburgh. They made them march barefoot through the Chartiers Creek in the middle of winter. And they did this just to inflict pain and torment on them. Again, it's called the Dreadful Night. And they'll arrest dozens and dozens and dozens, and dare I say hundreds of men. And they take them to the city of Pittsburgh and the area around it, and they turn the city of Pittsburgh into a massive internment camp, a giant prison encampment. They put up fences, they lock these men in, and they're going to hold them in there for weeks. Some of them were very violent offenders. Some of them had, really nothing to do with the Whiskey Rebellion. But all of them were paying the price for the actions of the last 3 years. Now, remember the cabin we saw in the beginning of this episode, the home of Gabriel Walker, on the grounds of the Pittsburgh Botanic Gardens. Federal troops, militias, under the command of Alexander Hamilton, was he there or not, we're not sure, went up to that cabin, exactly, and they beat down that door, and they dragged Gabriel Walker out of that house. They did the same thing to Isaac Walker, a little further down Robinson Run as well. And Joseph Scott, who was living on Montour Run, a little closer to Moon Township. It's amazing how this plays out. And these men are very badly mistreated. Whether they deserved it or not is a different question, but certainly the Constitution took a back seat in most cases that night. Through my research, you start to see a problem emerge. And the problem is a lot of these men are locked up, hundreds of them, in western PA, but there's really no evidence against a lot of them. It's almost like the army took too many men captive, arrested them, right, and didn't know what to do with them. They start letting them go one at a time by December of 1794. Frontier women are showing up with pillows stuffed under their shirts, pretending to be pregnant, begging to have their husbands released. Again, the army's not equipped to incarcerate hundreds of men, so they start to release them. And Light Horse Harry Lee and Alexander Hamilton and Daniel Morgan and the leaders of this force start to come up with a plan. We can't take all of these guys back to Philadelphia for trial. It's not practical. Hundreds of men. So they say, why don't we maybe start to single out key figures? And the document I'm going to show you next is going to knock your socks off. What you're looking at here is a letter written by Light Horse Harry Lee himself, and you can see his name signed at the bottom. And he makes what I would describe, and certainly for the men of Robinson Run, a fateful decision in December of 1794. They can't take everyone back to Philadelphia, so they'll just take the worst. But this is what Light Horse Harry Lee will write. In giving orders on who to arrest, he says this: You will use great circumspection to embrace none but real offenders. Nor will you be too promiscuous or too general. And here's the big one. The persons apprehended ought to be leading or influential characters, or particularly violent. That's what he says. They should be leading or influential characters, or particularly violent. And he makes a distinction there. Light Horse Harry Lee is not saying, take the cruelest, most depraved, guilty people back to Philadelphia. But he's saying, take leading or influential people. Now, I want you to think about what it means to be influential here in the West. These are Scots-Irish communities. Presbyterian churches are the center of their world. You get to be a leader of those churches by being someone who's respected in the community. Say you wanted to be a church elder, like Isaac Walker. Say you wanted to be a justice of the peace, like Joseph Scott. That's true for both of them. They weren't just randomly given that job. They were given that job because people admired them and respected them. So whenever we see Light Horse Harry Lee say leading or influential characters, or particularly violent, those are separate distinctions. What he's telling the army is to arrest and take to Philadelphia the people who are A, the most violent and should go for trial, or B, take out the heart, the leadership of the Scots-Irish here of the West. He wants to make an example out of the people that are the glue that holds the fabric of the West together. Don't take, Joe Schmo down the street. Take somebody important. Make them all suffer by seeing their leaders snagged and put in jail, and maybe hanged. That'll teach these Westerners that they are part of the United States, that they have to be loyal to the Constitution and our laws. That'll show them. He wants to make an example out of them. He can only take about 30 people back to Philadelphia. He's got to let the rest go, and there's hundreds. So who are those 30 going to be? The most influential, but maybe innocent, but most influential, or people that are downright guilty. So let's find out who he takes. What you have in front of you is an astounding document. This is a list of about 30 or so individuals that Light Horse Harry Lee and Alexander Hamilton and Daniel Morgan decide are the ones who need to go back to Philadelphia to be put on a grand trial and maybe hanged for this seditious rebel activity. Now, when you look at some of these names, you're going to see some pretty violent people. Philip Weigel, he's on the list. He's about in the middle. He was a brutally violent man. If you've ever heard of the whiskey made in Pittsburgh, Wiggle whiskey, that's very alliterative. It sounds nice, Wiggle whiskey. Well, his last name was pronounced Weigel. He was a bad dude. He burned down people's homes. He attacked not tax collectors, but the families of tax collectors. He's a bad guy, but he's on that list. So are several members of the Washington County militia who we spent so much time studying. Guys like John Hamilton. Remember, he was one of the first people to attack the first tax collector, Robert Johnson, in this region, and the leader of the Pennsylvania militia in Washington County. But there's other names on here that are really strange and troubling. One of them is John Corbley. John Corbley is not a violent man. John Corbley was from what is today Greene County, right outside of Waynesburg. And he was a reverend. He was a Presbyterian minister. His family was brutally killed in the Revolution by British allied native warriors right around the same time, mind you, that Robinson Run was destroyed. And he spent his days traveling the frontier, establishing churches. And they're going to take the Reverend John Corbley to Philadelphia as a rebel? It didn't make any sense. He was just a nice old man. He really had nothing to do with this. And then as we continue down the list, you're going to see two names highlighted there in red that should stand out to you out of everybody in Pittsburgh. 30 men go to Philadelphia for trial. 2 of them are from Robinson Run. The first name highlighted in red is Joseph Scott. We've been following Joseph Scott for a while. Local justice of the peace, settled in Moon Township. the largest landowner in Moon Township at the time, right along Montour's Run. And two beneath him, Isaac Walker. Isaac Walker. Isaac Walker's in his 50s at this point. What could he have done that was so bad? We've been following Isaac since episode number 1. And here in 1794, he's put in chains and dragged back to Philadelphia with a really disturbing group of rebels. What was his crime? The fact of the matter is, this gets back to the directive of Light Horse Harry Lee. He said to take violent offenders, and they got those. But he also said to take people of great importance, influential people. Joseph Scott is a justice of the peace, highly influential. Isaac Walker is an elder at Union Presbyterian Church. Remember, the Presbyterian Church is the center of Scots Irish life, highly influential. These men were arrested and taken back to Philadelphia. There's the proof. Not because they were bad guys, not because they were seditious rebels, traitors. They'll be called all those things. But they were chosen because they were important. They were the heart and soul of these Western communities. And the heart and soul was being taken out by these government officials. That was the point. You know, in the 1980s, there was a Speaker of the House. You probably remember him. Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics is local. But I think the lesson we've learned here is that it seems like all history is local too. But it's strange. Why would they be taken? It was always a mystery around Western PA why these two men were singled out, seemingly nonviolent men. Now that we saw Light Horse Harry Lee's letter, it makes perfect sense. Of course, we're going to dive in more. We're now going to go back to that typewritten document I received from my friend John Scott. One of the other things it had in there, which took my breath away, was not only where the amnesties were located and who witnessed them, but it actually listed the crimes committed. So here we go, folks. This is an exclusive here on Robinson Run. There you have in the middle of your screen, Joseph Scott. What does it say? Joseph Scott of Allegheny County, was taken prisoner on November 13th, 1794, and was marched to PG, Pittsburgh, and thence to PH, Philadelphia. He was present when he was charged with treason for being at Braddock's Field. Now, there's a second part there we'll get to later. He'll end up being released from jail. They all will. But now we see what the crime was. He was at Braddock's Field. Did that make him violent? Did that make him terrible? Well, there were thousands of men at Braddock's Field. I don't know that's enough to warrant him being chosen from the hundreds of men arrested to be made an example of. But when you understand he was a justice of the peace and he was an important person, now you see why. Now, John Scott, and I've spent so much time with him, and I'm so grateful for his help. He always had what he said, a family legend, that Joseph Scott was singled out as a justice of the peace because he was not prosecuting whiskey rebels. He essentially wasn't enforcing the law, and that made him a target. Now, John has no evidence of that. This is passed down through the family. But remember, for the Scots-Irish, they're not really a write it down kind of people, especially in the 1790s. They passed down oral traditions. That really made me think. Because when I first met John, he told me that, they said my great-great-great-great-grandfather Joseph was a justice of the peace. He didn't really have any evidence for that either. Of course, we did end up finding it. So that gave me some pause. Maybe he's right. Maybe Joseph Scott was not prosecuting his neighbors, or maybe he was acting in some unusual way as justice of the peace to bring down the wrath of Hamilton and George Washington on him. So I started doing some digging. And while I didn't find that, I did find something else pretty compelling. What I have in front of you is a letter from Thomas Nelson. Thomas Nelson was a commander, adjutant general, you can see him there, in Light Horse Harry Lee's Virginia militia. And he wrote a letter to Light Horse Harry Lee November 21st, 1794. This is just a few days before Joseph Scott is arrested. that says this, and I'll read it verbatim because the whole thing's really important. He says, quote, "The commander-in-chief has directed me in the most public manner to declare his surprise and mortification in discovering that some of the magistrates, aka justices of the peace, Joseph Scott, amongst them, with whom have been deposited books for the purpose of enabling the citizens of the district to manifest their attachment to their government by taking the oath of allegiance and subscribing in association." So judges are accepting oaths of allegiance, okay, as recommended by his address, the president, have assumed the privilege of annexing fees to their agency. They're taking money. These justices are taking money. This conduct is so repugnant to the system he has strenuously endeavored to establish, as well as so opposite to that spirit of affection and kindness which he is so anxious to inculcate and diffuse amongst the inhabitants, that he feels himself obligated at once to stop this practice, and hereby requires all magistrates who will not officiate without a fee or reward to return the books to their possession, that they may be otherwise placed. So what this letter is saying here is that local justices of the peace, okay, are taking these oaths of allegiance and giving out these amnesties as the federal government demanded of them, because remember, they are government officials technically, and they're charging people for it and keeping it. Now, this is happening more than once. It wouldn't be so, so prominent that Lee had to write about it if it wasn't. But maybe that's what Joseph Scott's doing. Maybe he's taking a cut for himself. I don't know. I don't have any evidence that he was not prosecuting his neighbors, but it may be possible that he was keeping a little extra for himself on the side. It's possible. So, John, if you're seeing this, maybe that helps us. Maybe it doesn't. But it gives us a little insight into the judicial process here in the West. Okay, let's continue. So we have an idea of why maybe Joseph Scott was arrested, his prominent office, and maybe he was skimming a little bit for himself off the side. Maybe. We can't say that for sure, but maybe. Look what else I found in the book. The Walker brothers and their indictments. Gabriel Walker of Allegheny County, Isaac Walker of Allegheny County. We'll go with Gabriel first. Was charged with treason for being at BF, Braddock's Field. All right. Isaac Walker was arrested November 13th, 1794, and taken to Philadelphia for trial. He was charged with treason for being at Braddock's Field. This is interesting. Both of these men will be arrested. Both of these men will be taken to Pittsburgh. But then we kind of lose track of the narrative. We know Isaac was on that document we saw earlier as being taken to Philadelphia for the real big trial, but Gabriel's name wasn't on it. Local lore always says that he went too, but his name wasn't on it. Albert Gallatin, who we met previously as a negotiator, U.S. Senator, he actually made a list of people in Philadelphia. Gabriel's name was on that. His name was on that. So the reality is, was Gabriel Walker taken to Philadelphia? I guess all we can say is maybe. In history, we always think we have to have a definitive answer for everything. The newsflash is we do not. We just have to share what we found. And what I can say is that all the sources agree Isaac Walker, the elder of Union Presbyterian Church, that's really what put the target on his back, in my opinion, was taken to Philadelphia to be made an example out of. Gabriel Walker, one source says he was. Other sources, more than one, say he wasn't. So we'll say that as a maybe, and that's all we can say. And we don't have to come down on it one way or the other. But what we can say is he was definitely arrested and taken to Pittsburgh. Whether or not he was taken to Philadelphia, we'll never know. But their major charge was that they were both at Braddock's Field. That is probably the least of the crimes anyone could have committed. But remember, Isaac Walker especially is ultra important because he's the elder. We had the document back in a previous episode. The first elder, in fact, a founder of Union Presbyterian Church. So if you're going to make an example out of somebody that crushes the soul of a community, who better than him? When these men are in Philadelphia, they'll be held for about 6 months for some of them. And they'll be kept in a place called the Walnut Street Prison. Now, Walnut Street Prison no longer exists in Philadelphia. It sat directly beside Independence Hall. If you've ever been there in Philadelphia, I'd encourage you to go. But I had found a newspaper account when I was writing my book, The Whiskey Rebellion, that talked about the fate of these men. And what it said was that when these 30 or so men returned to Philadelphia, they got there on Christmas Eve. And they were paraded through the streets. The newspaper called them wretched souls. They were shoeless. They were tied by their wrists and dragged behind a horse for everyone to see. The people of Philadelphia hated them. They sneered at them and hissed at them and threw tomatoes and manure at them. And it was meant to humiliate them. And what the newspaper article said was that the procession stopped in front of President Washington's mansion. And the president looked on at them in their terrible state, directly, this is the quote, smiling approvingly. So Washington had no love for rebels. No love for rebels at all. And our poor guys from Robinson Run, Isaac Walker, Joseph Scott, and maybe Gabriel Walker, they were there. You know, they were these wretched souls dragged the whole way across Pennsylvania to meet their fate. Isn't it amazing how much history comes out of this one little 6-mile creek we've been looking at for a year? I'm really stunned by it. But here's another letter that's a real kick in the pants. As they're holding these men in jail, they're trying to find anyone they can to testify against them. Who can come to Philadelphia and testify against these men? And here we have a letter of Judge William Rawle to Alexander Addison. And here's what he says. General Morgan was not very correct in the names he furnished. Only 3 last in the list came within the request: Ewing, Patton, and McCall. That's what he said. So what General Morgan, again, this is Daniel Morgan, Revolutionary hero, had said was, I think we can find some people to testify against their neighbors. Some people to come to Philadelphia as witnesses, take the stand, and condemn their neighbors to death. And look who showed up. A bunch of people were said they were going to come. Only 3 actually showed up. And look who's number 1 on the list. Ewing. James Ewing. So not only was James Ewing against politically his fellow neighbors in the Whiskey Rebellion, he was very pro-government. They were very anti-government. He actually makes the journey, hundreds of miles, in fact, to Philadelphia to take the stand against them. It's remarkable how far these people have come. But the proof is there. So does it work? Let's find out. Even though these men were arrested, put in jail without warrants, without judges, maybe justice on the fly, the longer they spend in Philadelphia in the Walnut Street jail, the more the Constitution comes back to hold. And what they found out in Philadelphia was they were basically going to have to let these guys go because no witnesses were showing up. And when the witnesses did come, it wasn't enough to condemn them. So one by one, most of these rebels had to be released. On the 9th, we see Black, Scott, and Paisley acquitted as not guilty by a Philadelphia grand jury. On the 11th, this is one of my favorite quotes, Thomas Birney, we saw him taken, is acquitted by the grand jury. When the evidence was called and sworn against him, they all swore they knew nothing about him in the matter. Which again, was he part of the rebellion? All the witnesses said, we don't know anything about him, which made the Judge Rawle cry out, this is great, good God, can I get nobody to swear against this man? None of the neighbors from here out west were petitioning against their own brethren. Maybe not even James Ewing. Thursday the 12th, here's what we care about. Bonham, Black, Mounts, Husbands, Paisley, and here we go, Walker, Birney, and Scott were discharged and taken out of jail. They were discharged under what was called ignoramus. Ignoramus. And ignoramus means they may be guilty, they may not. They don't have anyone to testify against them. But at this point, they have been in prison
for 5 months. Isaac Walker, head of the Union Presbyterian Church. Joseph Scott, local justice of the peace. Gabriel Walker is not mentioned here. Maybe there were 2 Walkers released that day. Maybe. I think it would have probably said Walkers. It doesn't. But again, at least one source says he was there. But whether he was or not, what really matters is, of the people we've been talking about, 3 of the 4 of them end up in Philadelphia. Isaac Walker and Joseph Scott as prisoners, James Ewing as a witness. Maybe Gabriel Walker was there too. I'm telling you, as a historian, you pick names at random, you almost never score like this. This is a real jackpot. For me, the last year has been totally worth it for just these last 3 or 4 slides. So what does the Whiskey Rebellion really all mean? Well, the Whiskey Rebellion was the greatest crisis of George Washington's presidency. It was the second most devastating and longest rebellion in American history. The Civil War is number 1. And it, is one of these really misunderstood events in American history because you need so much background information to understand where it comes from and why. Lucky for us here in Robinson Run, we have all that. We've seen these people bet on themselves and settle in the West when it was a very dangerous place. British at the time. We saw them fight in the Revolution and fight valiantly in the Washington County militia against British allied native peoples. We'd seen them begging the Continental Congress for supplies and support during the Revolution. And we saw no help come. We saw them sending letters warning that a terrible tragedy will befall them if they don't get some kind of help. And of course, in 1782, it happens. British allied native warriors under the command of Captain Andrew Bratt, as an adjunct or an attachment to his attack on Fort Henry and Wheeling, come into Robinson Run and annihilate it. These people distrust outside government. They had no problem with the Constitution. They just didn't have faith in it that it would work. And when the Whiskey Rebellion occurs, when not only is their livelihood attacked in their person, but their chief way of making money, selling whiskey, it's too much for them to bear. They turn to violent resistance. You really can't understand the Whiskey Rebellion as anything less than the culmination of 40 years of frontier history. And that was so much of why I wanted to do this project, because you can trace this from beginning to end and see exactly where it comes from. I think we've done something special with this series of Whiskey Rebellion episodes, and I'm very grateful that you joined me in the process. One more thing I want to say before we end the Whiskey Rebellion is that it was never called the Whiskey Rebellion in its own time. Not once. When Thomas Jefferson ran for president in 1800, there had only been 2 presidents before him, and they were both big government federalist presidents, George Washington and John Adams. And people didn't know any other way. They had a real top-down view of government. And when Thomas Jefferson ran in 1800, he said, I'm going to flip it. I made a new party called the Democratic Republican Party, and we're going to have a bottom-up view of the government. We're not going to be a government that tells people how to live their lives, but we're going to be a government that helps people live their best lives. But the people are in the forefront. And this event here was always fingered by Jefferson as like the most abusive evidence that the government had gotten to be too big and too intrusive. And people in their own time, every newspaper talked about this event. They never called it the Whiskey Rebellion. They called it the Western Insurrection. That's a much more frightening proposition, the Western Insurrection. And it wasn't until that Jefferson presidential campaign that it started to change, because Alexander Hamilton, a great enemy of Jefferson, was under attack politically because of this. People said, look at what you did, Hamilton. Look at the pain and anguish you caused. You overstepped. You were too extreme. Hamilton wanted to make the Western Insurrection, as they called it, seem smaller. So rather than calling it the Western Insurrection, he tried to minimize it. And he said that wasn't an insurrection. That was a little whiskey rebellion. That's what he said. It's a little whiskey rebellion. And wouldn't you know it, 230 years later, his political spin is something we still use. So thank you guys so much for joining me on this episode of Robinson Run. What a climax, right? Amazingly, guys, we have one episode left. One more. Let's hit it on a high note. Let's end it strong. I'll see you next time on Robinson Run.